Welcome to the channel, everyone! Thank you so much for clicking on this video. Whether you're here to learn something new, get inspired, or just relax and enjoy some great content, I'm really glad you're here. On this channel, I'll be sharing exciting stories, useful insights, and valuable tips that I hope will make your day a little better every time you watch. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. All right, let's get started. For 300 years, the Great Hall of the Valanthy Confederation was the shining heart of the galaxy. Carved from an asteroid by 7 different species, it was a monument to unity, with golden banners and crystal sculptures shimmering under the light of 1,000 floating lamps. But tonight, it felt more like a tomb. At the center of it all stood High Chancellor Morath, a leader so old his vibrant blue scales had faded to a dull, weary gray. He had guided his people through their brightest golden age, and now he was forced to watch it all burn down. What do you do when everything you've built is about to be wiped from existence? Stay with me to find out the impossible choice they made. "The Kree have taken the Orion sector," he announced, his voice hollow. The truth was a bitter pill, but there was no hiding it now. "Our fleets are gone. 60 million of our citizens are now trapped behind enemy lines." A shocked whisper swept through the delegates. The Orion sector wasn't just territory, it was their breadbasket. Losing it meant billions would slowly starve. "What about the relief fleet?" demanded Ambassador Keth of the Mirandi. She was a striking figure with 4 arms and skin like polished bronze. Her people were once legendary warriors before they laid down their arms to become scholars and artists. "They're gone," Morath said, the words landing like stones. "Supreme Commander Vorax ambushed them at the Nexus Gate. 300 ships, 40,000 crew members, all lost." The hall fell into a stunned silence. 300 ships. It had taken them 2 years of painful sacrifice to build that fleet, melting down priceless monuments and gutting museums to fuel the war factories, and the Kree had wiped it all out in a single afternoon. "How many ships do we have left?" a voice called from the back. It belonged to one of the Teth, a small, furry creature with large, practical eyes. Morath didn't want to say the number. It was shameful. It was a death sentence. But his people deserved to know. 412 combat vessels, he admitted. Maybe another 100 support ships. That's it. 400 ships against the Kree Dominion, an empire that had started the war with 3,000 warships and still had over 1,000 ready to fight. The math was simple. The math was death. "Then we have to surrender," said Ambassador Ven of the Salari, a tall, slender being whose skin glowed faintly. They were a people of philosophers and dreamers, dragged into a war they never wanted. "We can't win. All we can do is choose how we lose. Surrendering at least gives our people a chance to live." "Living under Kree rule isn't living," Keth shot back, her 4 hands clenched into fists. "We've all seen what they do to the worlds they conquer." Slavery, labor camps, and mass executions for anyone who even thinks of resisting. "I'd rather die." "Death is never the better option," Ven countered softly. "As long as we live, there is hope. The dead have no hope." The debate raged on, the same one they'd been having for 5 miserable years, ever since the tide of the war turned against them. Surrender or fight to the last. There were no other choices. Morath let them argue. He knew it was useless. It didn't matter what they chose. The Kree didn't want peace. They wanted total conquest. In their eyes, any species that wasn't Kree was either a slave or an enemy. That was their way. It had always been their way. The Confederation had tried diplomacy at first, offering trade, territory, anything for peace. The Kree had answered by vaporizing their diplomatic ship, with everyone still on board. That was 15 years ago. 15 years of watching everything they had ever built turn to ash. Of 1,000 worlds, they now held less than 100. Soon, it would be none. There is one option we haven't considered. A quiet voice cut through the noise. The arguments died instantly. Every head turned towards the speaker, a young volante named Sareth. He wore the uniform of a fleet admiral, a rank he'd only earned because all the senior admirals were already dead. Sareth had gotten the job by being one of the only ones left alive. "We've begged every known species for help," he continued. "Every species, except for one." A knot of dread formed in Morath's stomach. He knew exactly where this was going. It was a desperate, embarrassing idea he himself had dismissed a dozen times. "The humans," Sareth said. The name dropped into the silence, and the reaction was instant. Several delegates actually laughed out loud. Others just shook their heads in disbelief. "The humans?" Keth said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Those primitives from the Outer Rim? You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious," Sareth replied. "They have ships. They have weapons. They are the only power in this part of the galaxy that the Kree haven't conquered or absorbed." "And there's a reason for that," Ven scoffed. "They're irrelevant. Their technology is so backward, the Kree don't even see them as a prize worth taking. I heard their ships still use kinetic weapons. They've barely figured out basic shields. A single Kree cruiser could tear their whole fleet apart." "Maybe," Sareth said. "Or maybe not. The truth is, we know almost nothing about them. They keep to themselves. They don't trade. They don't share technology. We assume they're weak because their ships look different from ours. But an assumption isn't a fact." "I've seen their ships," Keth insisted. "I passed through their space years ago. They're ugly things. Just dark, heavy blocks of metal covered in thick armor plating. They look like they were designed by people who had never heard the word elegant. And their weapons are just tubes that shoot metal slugs. It's ancient. They would be useless against modern shields." "And yet," Sareth said softly, "they've survived. For 200 years, they've been out there. Every other young species in this region has been swallowed up or wiped out. But the humans are still there. That has to count for something." The hall went quiet again as Morath weighed Sareth's words. The humans were a mystery. They had burst onto the galactic scene 2 centuries ago, colonizing a dozen worlds before suddenly stopping and building a wall of silence around their territory. They turned away traitors and ignored diplomats. Everyone just figured they were scared, hiding in their little corner of the galaxy. But Sareth was right. Survival was a rare commodity these days. "Even if they agree to help," Morath said slowly, "what could they possibly do? Send 100 ships? 200? It wouldn't be enough to change anything." "No," Sareth agreed. "It wouldn't be enough to win. But it might be enough to buy us time. Time for our people to escape. Time to find a new home far away from the Kree. Time for anything to change." Morath looked at the faces around him and saw nothing but utter despair. These were the greatest leaders of 7 species. And they had given up. They were just waiting for the end. Maybe asking the humans for help was a fool's errand. But doing nothing was a guarantee of death. A tiny chance was better than no chance at all. "Very well," Morath declared. "Send a message to the humans. Ask for their help. We will offer them anything they want, and we will pray that they answer." The message shot across the galaxy that night, a desperate plea jumping across thousands of light years. It reached a human checkpoint station, where an officer read it, passed it to his commander, who passed it up the chain. 3 days later, a reply arrived. Morath read it in his private chambers. It was so short, so blunt, it was almost jarring. "We are coming," the message said. "Admiral Vasquez commands. Fleet strength, 200 vessels. Arrival in 14 standard days. Have docking facilities and tactical briefings ready. We'll talk terms after the fight is over. 200 ships. Morath wasn't sure if he should laugh or cry. 200 primitive ships against 1,000 Kree warships was like throwing pebbles at a tidal wave. But they were coming. After 15 long years of fighting and dying alone, someone was finally coming to help. For the first time in years, Morath felt a tiny, fragile spark of hope. 14 days later, the human fleet arrived, and from the bridge of her dreadnought, the unconquered sun, Admiral Elena Vasquez watched the Confederation's last stand come into view. She had to give them credit. It was a magnificent piece of engineering. The station was all graceful curves and flowing lines, looking more like it had been grown from space dust than built by hand. The Volante really did have the best architects. Around her, the bridge of her flagship was a hub of quiet efficiency. Her crew were professionals. They knew their roles inside and out, no hand-holding required. That was the human way. You train your people relentlessly, you trust them completely, and then you get out of their way. Her communications officer looked up. "Admiral, we're receiving docking instructions. They're putting us in Bay 7. "Bay 7? Vasquez echoed, pulling up the station's layout on her tactical screen. Bay 7 was the smallest dock they had, tucked away in a corner, usually reserved for garbage scows and repair drones. So the Great Confederation was shoving them in the back, hoping no one would see the primitives they'd called for help. Honestly, she wasn't even mad. She got it. To them, humans were a cosmic embarrassment. The Great Confederation, with all its high and mighty technology and supposed wisdom, had been brought to its knees and forced to ask a bunch of upstarts for a lifeline. Of course they wanted to keep that quiet. "Take us in," she ordered, her voice calm, "and tell the fleet to stay on high alert. I want every weapon hot and every pilot ready the second our boots are on the deck." "Yes, Admiral." Her ship, the unconquered sun, slid gracefully toward the station. Trailing behind it, the rest of the fleet emerged from the blackness of space, 200 ships flying in flawless formation, destroyers, cruisers, and battleships, all coated in the same matte black paint that drank sensor pings for breakfast. They were nothing like the sleek, elegant vessels of the Confederation. Human ships were all sharp angles and brutal, unapologetic function. They were slabs of thick armor plating, bristling with so many weapon turrets they looked more like enraged porcupines than starships. They were built for one thing and one thing only: war. Admiral Vasquez had given 40 years of her life to the fleet. She'd cut her teeth in the brutal colonial wars when humanity's own colonies tried to splinter from Earth's rule. She'd hunted pirates, crushed raiders, and put down rebel factions. She'd seen more combat than anyone in this entire sector of the galaxy. But this was different. This wasn't a human squabble. This wasn't her fight. For 2 centuries, the Confederation had treated humanity like a backward cousin. You don't talk about at parties. They'd sneered at human tech and openly laughed at their ships. And now, they came begging. A part of her, a bitter part, wanted to tell them to get lost. A part of her wanted to turn her 200 ships around and head straight home. Let the Confederation choke on its own pride. Let them find out what happens when you dismiss someone as a primitive. But she hadn't made Admiral by being petty. And this new enemy, the Kree, they were a plague that threatened everyone. If they toppled the Confederation, they wouldn't just stop. Eventually, they'd come knocking on humanity's door. Better to face them now, while they still had allies to stand with. The unconquered sun glided into the docking bay. Heavy magnetic clamps locked onto its hull with a shuddering thud, and the engines powered down with a low hum. They were here. "Admiral," her first officer reported, "we have a welcoming party at the airlock. The Confederation wants to see you. Immediately." "Of course they do," Vasquez muttered, straightening her uniform. It was simple, practical, dark blue with clean silver trim, completely bare of medals or ribbons. Human officers didn't wear their accomplishments on their chests. Their actions spoke for themselves. "Let them wait 5 minutes," she said coolly. "Then show them to the briefing room. I want our entire tactical team there, and get me the absolute latest intel on enemy positions." "Yes, Admiral." Vasquez left the bridge, her boots echoing in the ship's corridors. The unconquered sun wasn't pretty. Its walls were bare metal, its floors grated steel. Everything was about function. Everything was built to take a beating and keep on fighting. She passed crew members on her way. They gave her respectful nods, but never broke stride. On a human warship, there was no time for fancy salutes or ceremonies. There was always a system to check, a plate to patch, or a weapon to calibrate. The briefing room was just as Spartan, a large table and a holographic display. Vasquez took her place at the head and waited. A few minutes later, the door slid open and the Confederation delegation swept in. There were 3 of them: a Volanthi diplomat draped in official robes, a hulking Morandi warrior squeezed into military armor who had to be a general, and a young Volan in a fleet admiral's uniform. That last one threw her for a loop. He looked barely old enough to fly a shuttle, much less command an entire fleet. "Admiral Vasquez," the diplomat began, his voice as formal and chilly as deep space. "I am Ambassador Telen. This is General Keth of the Mirandi Defense Forces and Admiral Syrath of the Volanti Fleet. We welcome you to Confederation space." "Thanks," Vasquez replied. She didn't stand up. She didn't offer a bow. Humans didn't bother with all that pomp and circumstance. "Have a seat. We've got a lot to cover and not a lot of time to do it." The 3 aliens exchanged surprised glances. They clearly weren't used to being spoken to so bluntly, but they sat. "Before we begin," Telen said, recovering his composure, "I must express the Confederation's immense gratitude for your assistance. We are aware that humanity has no formal obligation to aid us." "Skip the speeches," Vasquez cut in, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Tell me about the enemy." Another round of awkward looks. The diplomat looked flustered, the general looked furious, but the young admiral, Syrath, just seemed intrigued. He leaned forward and activated the holo display. "The Kree Dominion commands approximately 1,000 combat-ready vessels," he said. "Their main fleet, under Supreme Commander Vorax, numbers around 800 ships. Their current position is here," he explained, pointing to a swirl on the star map. "The Arcturus Nebula. It's our last major defensive position." Vasquez stared at the map. The nebula was a massive cloud of gas and dust, dotted with a few habitable worlds. It was a defensible position, but just barely. The Kree could attack from a dozen different angles. Once they punched through the outer defenses, the planets inside would be sitting ducks. "What are your numbers?" she asked. "We have 412 ships," Syrath answered without hesitation, "plus support craft." Vasquez did the quick math. 400 Confederation ships plus her 200 against 800 Kree warships. The odds were terrible, but not impossible. She'd faced worse. "What can you tell me about their tactics?" she asked. "It's standard energy weapon doctrine," General Keth grunted. She spoke as if every word she had to say to a primitive was physically painful. "They use plasma lances and particle beams from a distance, then move in to overload shields at close range. They focus all their fire on a single target," Keth continued. "Overwhelm its shields, destroy it, and then move on to the next." "And your defenses?" "Energy shields," the general snapped. "Standard configuration. Our ships can withstand about 30 seconds of concentrated fire before a catastrophic shield failure." 30 seconds. Vasquez kept her expression perfectly neutral, but inside her mind was racing. 30 seconds was nothing. If the Kree focused the firepower of 800 ships on one target, they could vaporize a Confederation vessel every half-minute. Their entire fleet would be space dust in under 3 hours. "What about your offensive capabilities?" she pressed. "Plasma cannons, particle beam arrays," Keth rattled off. "The standard galactic armaments." "And how long does it take you to destroy a Kree ship?" Keth paused. "Well, it depends on the class. A cruiser, maybe 2 minutes of sustained fire," she admitted grudgingly. "A battleship could take 5 to 7 minutes." Their shields are far superior to ours." Vasquez gave a slow, deliberate nod. The grim picture was now crystal clear. The Confederation was losing this war because they were outgunned and outmatched in every conceivable way. Weaker shields, slower weapons, their ships died faster and killed slower. It was a simple, brutal equation, and the answer was total annihilation. "All right," she said, leaning forward. "Here's what's going to happen. When the battle starts, the human fleet will advance first. We will engage the enemy head-on." "Absolutely not!" General Keth exploded, crossing her thick arms over her chest. "You cannot possibly expect us to hide behind you. We are warriors. We will fight on the front lines." "You will die on the front lines," Vasquez said, her voice dangerously calm. "Your shields will collapse in 30 seconds. Your weapons don't kill fast enough. If you charge in, you will be slaughtered. But if you hang back and provide fire support, you might just live long enough to be useful." "And what about your ships, Admiral?" young Cyrith asked, his voice sharp with curiosity, not anger. "Our sensors indicate your shield generators are barely functional. They're even weaker than ours. The Kree will tear through you even faster than they would us." Vasquez allowed herself a small, cold smile. It was a smile that held no warmth at all. "You let me worry about that," she said. The meeting dragged on for another hour. They argued over fleet formations, communication protocols, and emergency retreat plans. The Confederation delegates got more and more frustrated with Vasquez's complete refusal to explain the details of her strategy. She told them exactly where to put their ships. She told them precisely when to shoot and when to hold their fire. But she never told them why. Finally, as they were wrapping up, Admiral Cyrath asked the question that had been hanging over the entire room. "Admiral," he said, his voice earnest, "do you honestly believe you can win this? You're outnumbered 4-1. Your technology is, by galactic standards, primitive. The Kree have never once been defeated in a direct fleet engagement," he continued. "What on earth makes you think this time will be any different?" Vasquez stood up, her gaze locking onto the young admiral. For a long moment she just looked at him, and in his eyes she saw something she recognized. Hope. It was a desperate, fragile thing, but it was there. "Admiral Cyrath," she said, her voice low and steady. "My people have an old saying. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. But humans, we've never really fit into either of those categories. We're just stubborn. We don't know when to quit. We don't know how to lie down and die. We have clawed our way back from ice ages, plagues, and wars that wiped out billions. We survived it all for one simple reason. We refused to stop fighting." She stopped at the door and looked back. "The Confederation thinks they know war," she said, her voice ice. "They're about to find out they know nothing." And with that, she was gone. 3 days later, the Kree fleet arrived. The battle for the Arcturus Nebula was here. Aboard the Kree dreadnought, the Eternal Dominion, Supreme Commander Vorax watched his armada rip open the fabric of hyperspace. 800 warships, the largest fleet the Dominion had ever mustered, blotted out the stars like a swarm of metal locusts. Every single ship was a marvel of Kree engineering, with sleek hulls designed to deflect sensor scans and powerful shield generators that could shrug off almost any attack. Their weapon arrays could turn enemy armor into molten slag in seconds. This was the very fleet that had brought half the galaxy to heel. This was the force that had crushed the mighty Confederation, forcing them to their knees. And now it was here to finish the job. Vorax was a mountain of a creature, even for a Kree. His people were tall and broad, their thick gray skin covered in natural armor plates. Their eyes were like chips of obsidian, set deep in skulls that could take a blow that would kill most other species. They came from a brutal world where only the absolute strongest survived, and that single rule had guided their entire civilization for 10,000 years. The weak exist only to serve the strong. It was, to them, the most basic truth of the universe. A truth the Confederation had forgotten. They'd built their entire society on flimsy ideas like cooperation and equality, on the ridiculous belief that different species could actually work together as partners. They had made themselves soft, and now, like all weak things, they would suffer what they must. "Commander," his tactical officer, a younger Kree named Drath, reported. "Sensors show the enemy fleet gathering near the 4th planet. We're counting approximately 400 vessels." Vorax let out a low rumble of contempt. 400 ships. The Confederation once commanded fleets of thousands. Now they were reduced to this pathetic little remnant. It was almost pitiful. Almost. "They're forming a standard defensive line," Drath said. "It looks like they're getting ready for a last stand." Of course they were. What other choice did they have? There was nowhere left to run. The Arcturus Nebula was their final hiding place. If they lost here, the war was over. The Confederation would simply cease to exist. Its member species would become slaves of the Dominion, as was right and proper. Vorax allowed himself a brief, grim smile. He'd waited 15 years for this day. 15 long years of grinding, relentless war, of slowly but surely crushing the Confederation's will to fight. Sure, there had been a few setbacks. The Confederation had fought with more spirit than he'd expected. But the end result was never, ever in doubt. The strong always conquer the weak. "Commander," Drath said again, his tone suddenly different. There was a flicker of confusion in his voice. "I'm picking up more ships on the edge of the engagement zone." "Reinforcements?" Vorax felt a flash of irritation. Had the Confederation scraped up more allies from some forgotten corner of the galaxy? It wouldn't change anything, but it might drag out his victory. "I don't think so, Commander," Drath replied. "The ship designs don't match any known Confederation profile." He paused, squinting at his console. "They appear to be human vessels." Vorax slowly turned to look at his tactical officer. "Human?" "Yes, Commander. Roughly 200 ships. They're moving to the very front of the Confederation formation." Humans. Vorax racked his brain, searching for what little he knew about the species. They were galactic newcomers, having figured out faster-than-light travel only a few centuries ago. They lived way out on the outer rim, in a tiny cluster of star systems nobody gave a second thought. The Dominion hadn't even bothered conquering them. They had nothing of value. Their technology was primitive. Their military was a joke. They were irrelevant. And yet, here they were, flying headfirst into a battle that had nothing to do with them. "Interesting," Vorax grunted. "Put them on the main screen." The view screen shifted, showing the human fleet. Vorax examined the ships with a professional's eye. They were ugly, he decided. Where Kree warships were smooth and elegant, the human ships were all harsh angles and crude, blocky shapes. They looked like they'd been slapped together by builders who had never heard of aerodynamics or design theory. Their hulls were covered in thick, dark plates of some unknown material, and their weapon turrets were just simple tubes, probably some kind of kinetic cannon. "Analysis?" he demanded. Drath tapped at his console. "Their ships have shield generators, but they're incredibly weak. Our weapons will punch right through them in seconds. Armor seems to be a standard metallic composite. Nothing special. Weapons are kinetic projectile systems, just as you thought. Primitive, but they'll work." "Then what are they doing here?" "Unknown, Commander. Maybe the Confederation offered them some land or resources to die for them." Vorax made that contemptuous sound again. So the humans were fools. They'd actually answered the Confederation's desperate call for help, flown halfway across the galaxy to die in a war they couldn't possibly win. They would be vaporized right alongside their new friends, having achieved absolutely nothing. Even so, he felt a tiny spark of respect. They chose to fight instead of hide. That took guts, even if it was stupid. He decided he would grant them a quick death, as a reward for their bravery. "Maintain course," he ordered. "We will engage as planned. Target the human ships first." "They're leading the charge, so they'll be the first to burn. Once they're gone, we'll clean up what's left of the Confederation." "Yes, Commander." The Kree fleet surged forward. 800 ships in perfect lethal formation, weapons glowing hot, shields humming at full power. They had done this 1,000 times. They knew exactly how this was going to end. Across the void, the Confederation fleet watched them approach. On the bridge of the Volante battleship Starlight's Edge, Admiral Sirath tried to keep his fear in check. He'd seen combat before, but nothing like this. The enemy fleet was double their size. The Kree had better weapons, better shields, better everything. By every single calculation, this battle was already over. And still, that human, Admiral Vasquez, had ordered her fleet to advance. Sirath stared at the human ships on his tactical display. They were pulling away from the main Confederation line, heading straight for the oncoming Kree armada. It was suicide. It had to be. No commander in their right mind would just throw their ships directly into the fangs of a superior force. "What are they doing?" his first officer, a young Volante named Talus, asked. Her voice was stretched thin with anxiety. "They're going to be shredded in the first volley." "I don't know," Sirath admitted, his own heart pounding. But Admiral Vasquez sounded confident. What could she possibly be confident about? Their ships are worse than ours, and our ships are hopelessly outclassed by the Kree. There isn't some secret weapon that can just change the math. Sirath didn't have an answer. He could only watch as the human fleet picked up speed, their dark ships forming a wedge aimed right at the enemy's heart. The unconquered sun, Vasquez's flagship, was at the very tip, leading the way. Whatever she was planning, she was putting herself in the most danger. "Open a channel to the human flagship," he ordered. "Channel open, Admiral." "Admiral Vasquez, this is Admiral Sirath. The Kree fleet is about to engage. I strongly recommend you fall back and let our ships take the first hit. Your vessels can't possibly withstand concentrated fire from their main guns." There was a brief silence. Then Vasquez's voice came through, sounding unnervingly calm, almost casual. "Thank you for your concern, Admiral, but we have a plan. Just hold your position and be ready to back us up when the fireworks start." "What plan? You haven't told us anything. How are we supposed to support you if we have no idea what you're about to do?" Another pause. "Admiral Sirath, do you trust me?" The question caught him off guard. Trust her? He barely knew the woman. They'd met once for a few minutes. She had been cold, dismissive, and refused to explain any of her strategy, treating the entire Confederation delegation like children. But she had come. When no one else in the entire galaxy would help them, the humans had answered. That had to count for something. "I trust you, Admiral," Sirath said, though he wasn't entirely sure if he was telling the truth. "Good. Then trust me now. Keep your ships back. Do not, I repeat, do not engage unless I give the order. And when you see what happens next, try not to panic. Everything is going according to plan." The channel clicked off. Sirath stared at his tactical display, watching the tiny human fleet close the distance to the enemy. They would be in weapons range in less than 2 minutes. "Admiral," Talus said, her voice a whisper. "What do we do?" Sirath took a deep breath. "We follow our orders. Hold position. All ships, prepare for battle, but do not fire until commanded." All across the Confederation fleet, the same confused conversations were taking place. Officers questioned the strategy. Captains fretted about the primitive outsiders leading their last defense. And everyone watched the human ships fly forward, wondering if they were about to witness incredible courage or absolute madness. Aboard the Kree flagship, Vorax watched the same scene unfold with growing amusement. "They're charging right at us," Drath reported, a note of sheer disbelief in his voice. "No evasive patterns, no attempt to use the nebula for cover. They're flying straight down our throats." "Brave but stupid," Vorax said with a sneer. "The Confederation must have promised them something truly spectacular to get them to throw their lives away like this. They're either clueless about how powerful we are, or they're complete fools," Vorthax mused, leaning forward in his command chair. "All ships, prepare to engage. Target the human vessels. I want full power to all forward weapons. I want them vaporized in the first volley." The Kree fleet moved as one. 800 warships shifted into position, their primary weapons locking onto the approaching human formation. Plasma lances and particle beam arrays hummed to life, their energy levels screaming toward maximum. The sheer firepower of this fleet was breathtaking. It could crack a planet, shatter a moon. It could most certainly obliterate 200 primitive ships. "Range to target?" Vorthax asked. 20,000 kilometers in closing, Commander. They'll be in perfect firing range in 30 seconds. Vorthax watched the human ships loom larger on his main view screen. He could make out the details now. The ugly, boxy hulls, the thick slabs of armor plating, the crude-looking weapon turrets. They looked like museum pieces, relics from a forgotten era somehow brought back to life. 10 seconds to optimal range. The moment was almost here. The opening shot of the final battle. Once the human fleet was space dust, the Confederation would lose its last glimmer of hope. They'd see that not even their so-called allies could save them. They would finally understand that resistance was pointless. "Weapons range achieved. All batteries have target locks." Vorthax allowed himself a smug smile. Fire. 800 ships unleashed hell at the exact same moment. Thousands of beams of plasma and supercharged particles tore across the void, all converging on the tiny human formation. The darkness of space ignited, as if a new star was being born. The energy output was enough to power a whole civilization for a year, more than enough to burn through any shield ever conceived. The devastating volley struck the front line of human ships. Their shields flickered and died almost instantly, just as expected. The flimsy human shields couldn't handle even a tiny fraction of that power. They collapsed in less than 3 seconds. Across the Kree fleet, officers broke into cheers. Across the Confederation fleet, hearts plummeted. The human shields were gone. Now the ships themselves would be ripped apart. The slaughter was about to begin, but it never came. Vorthax stared at his view screen, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. The human ships were still there. They were still moving forward. Their shields were gone, sure, but the ships themselves were perfectly fine. The plasma and particle beams that should have melted their hulls were splashing against their armor like harmless rain. "What is happening?" he roared. "Why aren't they destroyed?" His second-in-command, Drath, was staring at his own console, his eyes wide with shock. I don't understand, Commander. Our weapons are hitting them, but they're not getting through. The armor, it's just absorbing the energy." "Impossible. No armor can withstand that kind of concentrated plasma fire. The heat alone should melt any known material." "I'm reading the data correctly, Commander. The human ships are still at 100% integrity. Our weapons are having 0 effect." Vorthax felt a cold knot form in his stomach. It was a feeling he hadn't had in decades, one he thought he'd never feel again. It was uncertainty. Meanwhile, on the bridge of the human flagship, the unconquered sun, Admiral Vasquez watched the Kree's barrage wash over her fleet like a gentle tide against a stone cliff. The ship gave a slight shudder as trillions of joules of energy slammed into the hull, but that was it. The armor held. It was designed to. "Damage report," she said, her voice perfectly calm. "Minimal, Admiral," her first officer replied. "Hull temperature is elevated. but well within acceptable limits. All systems are green. No casualties. And the rest of the fleet? Same report across the board, Admiral. The enemy's weapons can't scratch our paint. Vasquez nodded. She had expected this, but seeing theory become reality was still deeply satisfying. The galaxy had made a fundamental mistake. Everyone had. They assumed that energy weapons and energy shields were the only way to wage war in space. For thousands of years, every species had followed the exact same script: develop stronger shields to block energy weapons, then develop stronger weapons to overwhelm those shields. It was a never-ending arms race, an endless cycle of one-upmanship. Humanity had taken one look at that cycle and decided it was idiotic. Shields were elegant, yes. They could block almost anything if they had enough power. But they were a massive energy drain. They failed completely and catastrophically when they were overwhelmed. They were a single point of failure that could get your entire ship, and everyone on it, killed. Armor was different. Armor didn't need power. It didn't fail all at once. It could soak up damage that would have vaporized a shielded ship. It was heavy. It was ugly, and everyone thought it was primitive. But it worked. For 2 centuries, while the rest of the galaxy laughed at them, human engineers had been perfecting armor technology. They had developed alloys that could withstand temperatures hot enough to melt diamond. They had created composite materials that could spread an energy blast across the entire hull, making it harmless. They had built ships that could literally fly through the core of a star and come out the other side. The shield generators on human ships were a joke. Everyone in the galaxy agreed on that. What nobody understood was that human ships didn't need shields. They were just for show, a clever disguise to make them look just like everyone else. The real defense was the 10 meters of hyper-advanced armor plating covering every inch of every human vessel. The Kree were firing energy weapons at ships specifically designed to laugh at energy weapons. They might as well have been throwing pebbles at a mountain. "Admiral," the communications officer cut in, "Admiral Sarath is on the line. He's demanding an explanation as to why our ships aren't destroyed." Vasquez smiled. "Tell him the explanation is on its way. All ships, advance to weapons range. Prepare the main batteries." The human fleet surged forward. The Kree continued their useless barrage, pouring endless streams of energy at the advancing ships. It accomplished nothing. The human vessels just kept coming, their dark hulls glowing faintly from the heat they absorbed, but otherwise completely unharmed. On the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, Vorthax was screaming orders. "Increase power to weapons. Target their engines. Find a weak spot." "We are at maximum power, Commander," Drath shouted back, his voice shaking. "There is no weak point. Their armor is the same everywhere. We can't get through." "Then ram them!" Vorthax shrieked. "All ships prepare for ramming maneuvers." "Commander, if we ram them, we'll be destroyed too." "I don't care. They cannot be allowed to reach us." But it was already too late. The human fleet had closed the distance. Admiral Vasquez gave the order. "All ships, open fire." The human fleet answered with a sound that no one in the galaxy had heard for 10,000 years. It was the deep, bone-rattling thunder of kinetic weapons. Massive railguns, each one capable of firing a tungsten slug at a significant fraction of the speed of light. These projectiles weren't elegant. They weren't sophisticated. They were just incredibly dense chunks of metal moving incredibly, unbelievably fast. They slammed into the Kree fleet like the fist of an angry god. The first volley hit the lead Kree ships. Their shields flared brightly, desperately trying to absorb the kinetic impact. But shields were made to disperse energy, not stop a physical object. A plasma beam could be spread out across the shield's surface, its energy watered down until it was harmless. You couldn't disperse a solid tungsten slug traveling at near light speed. It was pure, unstoppable force, and it went straight through. The first Kree dreadnought took 4 hits in quick succession. The slugs punched through its shields as if they weren't even there. They tore through the hull, leaving gaping holes the size of skyscrapers. The ship's reactor containment failed. There was a silent, brilliant flash of light, and then the dreadnought was simply gone, replaced by an expanding cloud of superheated gas and shattered metal. The entire exchange had lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds from the first human shot to the complete annihilation of the ship. A vessel that had taken years to build, that had survived dozens of battles, that the Kree considered practically invincible, was gone in 4 seconds. And the human fleet just kept firing. Vorthax watched in pure horror as his ships died around him. His fleet, his invincible armada, was being torn to shreds. The human weapons were like nothing he'd ever encountered. They didn't care about shields. They didn't care about evasive maneuvers. They simply smashed through everything in their path. "Fall back!" he screamed. "All ships, fall back! Emergency withdrawal!" But the humans weren't about to let them run. They pressed their attack, their railguns firing over and over. Each shot a death sentence for another Kree ship. Cruisers, destroyers, battleships, they all died the same way. Their shields were useless, their armor was paper-thin, and their crews never even knew what hit them. On the bridge of the Confederation flagship, the Starlight's Edge, Admiral Sarath watched the one-sided slaughter with an expression of total disbelief. "By the stars," his first officer whispered, "they're destroying them. The humans are actually destroying them." Sarath couldn't speak. He'd seen countless battles. He'd watched his friends die. He'd witnessed both atrocities and miracles. But he had never, ever seen anything like this. The Kree fleet, the terror of the galaxy, the unstoppable force that had conquered 1,000 worlds, was being systematically dismantled. A ship died every few seconds, each death marked by a silent flash of light. The human weapons weren't beautiful or elegant. They were brutally, horrifically effective. "Admiral," his comms officer said, his voice filled with awe. "Admiral Vasquez is on the channel." Sarath forced himself to focus. "Put her through." Vasquez's voice filled the bridge, as calm and steady as if she were ordering lunch. "Admiral Sarath, the enemy is breaking. We are in pursuit. If your ships would like to join us for the cleanup, now would be an excellent time." Sarath finally found his voice. "Yes, Admiral. Yes, we would." "All right, let's do this," the Admiral said. "All ships, move in and support the human fleet." The Confederation forces surged forward, but honestly, there was nothing left for them to do. The fight was already over. The mighty Kree armada, or what was left of it, was in a full-blown panic. These were the ships that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries, and now they were running for their lives, chased by a bunch of so-called primitives in ugly ships with weapons that shouldn't have worked. Aboard his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, Vorthax was screaming, a raw sound of fury and utter disbelief. His fleet was being torn to shreds. His officers were frozen in shock. His entire empire, everything he had built, was crumbling around him. "How?" he roared to the empty air. "How is this happening? They're cavemen. Their tech is ancient. How are they crushing us?" Nobody had an answer. Not a single soul could explain how 200 primitive rust buckets were annihilating 800 of the most advanced warships in the galaxy. It was impossible. It broke every rule of space combat the Kree had ever written. But it was happening, right in front of Vorthax's eyes, and he was powerless to stop it. The slaughter lasted for another 2 minutes. In that time, the human fleet vaporized another 112 Kree destroyers, crippled 200 more, and sent the rest scrambling back the way they came. When the chaos finally subsided, Admiral Vasquez stood on her bridge, calmly surveying the ghost-like wreckage. Shattered ships drifted silently through space, their hulls ripped open, their crews gone forever. The whole nebula was a graveyard of debris and crackling radiation. "Report," she asked, her voice steady. "Any casualties?" The reply came back, crisp and clear. "None, Admiral. We didn't lose a single ship." Not one. 200 ships went up against 800, and the humans came back without a scratch. Vasquez allowed herself the faintest of smiles. "Get me Admiral Sirath. Let him know the battle's over. And tell him the Confederation just won the war." Behind her, on the main view screen, the last of the Kree ships vanished into deep space. They had shown up expecting to wipe out the Confederation, thinking it would be an easy win. They couldn't have been more wrong. On his own ship, Admiral Sirath was experiencing a silence he'd never known. He stood on the observation deck of the Starlight's Edge, just staring at the field of junk that, only an hour ago, was the most feared military force in the known galaxy. Broken and burning Kree warships floated in the void like dead leaves in a pond. Their lights were out, their weapons were cold, their crews were gone. It just shouldn't have been possible. Every simulation, every expert, every projection had said the same thing. The Confederation was going to lose, badly. The numbers were stacked against them. The technology gap was a canyon. The Kree were stronger, faster, and better armed. They should have won, but they didn't. They were annihilated, and Sirath had no idea why. "Admiral." It was Talus, his first officer. She had been standing beside him, just as quiet, just as stunned. "The human flagship is asking for permission to come aboard." "Admiral Vasquez would like to meet with you." Sirath nodded, his mind still reeling. "Grant permission. Set up a reception in the main conference room." "Should I call the other senior officers, sir?" "No," he said. "Just me. I think I need to wrap my head around this before I try to explain it to anyone else." Talus gave him a look of deep concern. She was young, but sharp enough to know that the universe had just fundamentally shifted. Everything they thought they knew had just been proven wrong. Sirath walked through the corridors of his flagship. His crew was silent, speaking only in hushed whispers. They had all just witnessed a miracle, and they were still trying to figure out what it all meant. The conference room was large and formal, designed for high-stakes diplomacy, with beautiful art on the walls and a massive window overlooking the stars. But today the view was pure destruction. The wreckage of the Kree fleet filled the window, glinting in the light of a distant sun. The door slid open, and Admiral Vasquez walked in. To Sirath's surprise, she was completely alone. He'd expected a full entourage of guards and officers, but she just strolled in by herself, hands clasped casually behind her back, her expression perfectly calm. "Admiral Sirath," she said with a nod. "Thank you for seeing me." "Thank you for saving us," Sirath replied, gesturing to a chair. "Please, have a seat." They sat facing each other, and for a long moment the only sound was the faint hum of the ship. The silence was thick with questions that Sirath was dying to ask. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. "How?" he blurted out. "Seriously, how did you do that?" Vasquez just tilted her head. "Do what exactly?" "You know what. Your shields were gone in seconds. Our sensors saw it. The Kree weapons should have torn you apart. By every law of physics we know, your ships should be scrap metal right now, but they're not. You survived, and then you wiped out their entire fleet in less than 3 minutes. Sirath leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "How?" Vasquez was quiet for a beat, as if deciding just how to explain the impossible to a child. "The answer is actually pretty simple," she said at last. "We never counted on our shields." "But shields are everything. They were the only thing that works against energy weapons. Without them, any ship would be vaporized instantly." "That," Vasquez said, "is what this entire galaxy has believed for thousands of years. It's an endless arms race. You build stronger energy weapons, so I build stronger energy shields. The whole playbook for space combat is built on that one idea." "Because it's true, isn't it?" Vasquez simply pointed out the window at the field of shattered ships. "Those ships had the most advanced shields in the galaxy. How well did that work out for them?" Sirath didn't have a response. The Kree shields had been completely useless against whatever the humans had thrown at them. Their projectiles had passed right through as if the shields weren't even there. Shields are made to spread out energy, Vasquez explained. A plasma bolt hits the shield, and the energy gets dispersed over the whole surface until it's too weak to do any damage. It's a clever trick, but it only works on energy, and our weapons don't fire energy. That's right, she confirmed. We use physical projectiles, basically really dense metal slugs fired at insane speeds. When one of our slugs hits a shield, the shield tries to disperse the energy like it's supposed to. But the slug isn't just energy, it's mass. It has momentum. The shield might absorb some of the kinetic force, but it can't stop the chunk of metal. The slug just punches right through, carrying enough power to rip through any hull. Sirath's mind was racing. It was so simple, so painfully obvious now that she'd said it. Energy shields were never meant to stop physical objects. They were designed to stop energy beams because for 10,000 years, that's all anyone ever used. Nobody ever thought to question the basic premise. But your ships, he said, the pieces clicking into place. Your shields failed. The Kree's weapons still should have destroyed you, even if yours were working against them. Vasquez actually smiled. Our shields were never meant to protect us, she said. They were a disguise. A disguise? When humanity first met other species, we noticed you all used the same tech. Energy weapons, energy shields. If we'd shown up with our real defenses, everyone would have seen us as a threat. The whole galaxy might have ganged up on us before we were ready. So you faked having weak shields? We slapped some basic shield generators on our ships because that's what everyone expected, she said. But we never bothered to upgrade them. They were just for show. A way to make us look like we belonged. To make everyone underestimate us. Sirath felt a cold chill run down his spine. The humans had been playing the long game, hiding their real strength. For 200 years, they had let the galaxy think they were weak, primitive, and harmless. And nobody ever guessed the truth. If your shields were a decoy, he said, almost afraid to ask, then what is your real defense? Vasquez gestured toward the window again, toward her fleet floating in the distance. The human ships were clustered together, their dark hulls completely untouched by the battle. Armor, she said simply. We took a different path. Instead of trying to block energy with force fields, we built ships that could just soak it up with physical protection. Armor? Sirath almost laughed. But armor has been useless for millennia. Modern energy weapons can melt through any known metal. No material can stand up to that kind of concentrated plasma. No material anyone else has, Vasquez corrected gently. Human scientists spent 2 centuries perfecting armor technology. We've developed alloys and composites that don't exist anywhere else. Materials that can absorb unbelievable amounts of heat and energy without breaking. They're designed to spread the energy across the entire hull, so no single spot ever gets overloaded. She leaned back, looking completely relaxed. Our ships have 10 meters of advanced armor plating. The Kore could have shot at us all day long, and they never would have punched through. 10 meters. Sirath tried to even imagine it. The best Confederation ships had maybe half a meter of hull plating, just enough to stop space dust and tiny meteorites. The idea of wrapping a ship in 10 meters of solid armor was insane. It would be ridiculously heavy. The engines needed to move, it would have to be colossal. The cost would be astronomical. But it would work. If the humans really had invented materials that could shrug off energy weapons, then armor was the perfect defense. It needed no power. It couldn't be shut down. It couldn't cascade fail. It was just solid, brute force protection that could take a beating forever. That's why, Sirath said, the final realization dawning on him. That's why you never shared technology. That's why you always kept to yourselves. You weren't just hiding this tech. You were protecting it, Vasquez stated, her voice calm. And in doing so, we were protecting ourselves. If the Kree knew what we were really capable of, they would have tried to wipe us out before we were ever a threat. We needed the years to build our fleet, to perfect our weapons, and to get ready for the day we knew was coming. And that day is today. The Confederation sent out a distress call, and we decided it was finally time to answer. The Admiral was silent for a long moment, his mind reeling. These humans, they'd been planning this for centuries. They had been the galaxy's silent observers, gathering their power, just waiting for the perfect moment to step onto the stage. And when they finally did, it was in the most unbelievable way imaginable. It was genius. It was terrifying. And it brought up a question that Syra was almost too scared to ask. But why help us? He finally managed. You could have stayed in the shadows. The Kree weren't a threat to you. You had absolutely nothing to gain by revealing yourselves. Vasquez's eyes seemed to age 100 years in a second, a deep weariness settling in them. That's not entirely true, she said softly. The Kree would have come for us. It was only a matter of time. Once they were done crushing the Confederation, they would have set their sights on the rest of us. We're on their list. Everyone is on their list. So this was just about self-preservation, Syra concluded. Partly, Vasquez admitted, then paused, choosing her next words with care. Admiral Kairoeth, when your SOS came through, our leadership was divided. Some argued we should remain hidden. Let the Confederation collapse. Use the extra time to build up our own walls even higher. Honestly, it was the most logical move. But that's not the move you made, Syra said. No, because logic isn't the only thing that guides us. Vasquez rose and walked over to the viewport, staring out at the graveyard of ships. The Confederation reached out to us, even when you believed we were a primitive race. You asked for help from a species you thought was beneath you. That showed humility. It showed desperation. But it showed something more important than all of that. It showed trust. She turned to look him in the eye. You trusted that we would at least try to help. You trusted that even a primitive species might have something to offer. That kind of trust is so rare in this galaxy, and it deserves to be rewarded. Syra felt something shift deep inside his chest. It took him a second to recognize the feeling. It was hope. Real, genuine hope. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime. There was another reason too, Vasquez went on. A reason my people understand on a fundamental level. And what's that? Syra asked. Survival isn't enough. Vasquez's voice was low but burned with intensity. My species. We've survived everything you can imagine. Ice ages that spanned 10,000 years. Plagues that wiped out half our people. Wars that turned our world to ash. We're good at surviving because we simply refuse to lie down and die. But just surviving is meaningless if you don't have something worth surviving for. She waved a hand toward the star-dusted view. This galaxy is filled with races who have forgotten how to hope. They just accept that the powerful will always rule and the weak will always pay the price. They've bought into the lie that might makes right. They've completely given up on the dream that things could ever be different. The Confederation. We tried to be different, Syra said, his voice barely a whisper. Yes. You tried to build a union based on cooperation, not on conquest. You were failing, but you never stopped trying. And that matters. It matters more than you could possibly know. Vasquez came back and sat down. Humanity chose to help you because we believe in the very thing you were trying to build. A galaxy where people work together, where strength is used to protect the vulnerable, not to crush them. A galaxy where there is still hope for a better tomorrow. And now we get to rebuild it, together. Syra felt the sting of tears in his eyes, a sensation he hadn't felt in decades. He had conditioned himself to be the unshakable leader, the stoic admiral who could bear any burden without cracking. But this wasn't weakness. This was relief. Gratitude. It felt like a mountain of weight he'd been carrying for so long had just vanished. "Admiral Vasquez," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know how my people can ever thank you. We had given up. We were just waiting for the end. And you saved us." "You saved yourselves," Vasquez corrected him gently. "You fought a losing war for 15 years against impossible odds. You never ever surrendered. You held your civilization together when any other would have shattered. That's why we came. You proved you were worth saving." A long, comfortable silence filled the room as the two admirals sat side by side, just watching the stars. The debris field, the tomb of the Kree fleet, was slowly breaking apart, its pieces drifting off into the endless night. It was the end of one story and the beginning of a new one. "So what happens now?" Syra asked at last. "The Kree won't take this lying down. They'll regroup. They'll be back." "Yes," Vasquez agreed. "They will. But they won't find the same galaxy they left. The Confederation is going to have new tech, new ships, and new friends. Humanity. And anyone else out there who wants to join us in building a better future." Vasquez smiled, and for the first time, it was a genuinely warm smile, with no strategy or hidden agenda behind it. "Admiral Syra, I have a proposal for you." "I'm listening." "This war isn't over. The Kree still control most of their territory. They still have hundreds of ships, thousands of soldiers, and millions of beings living under their boot. Taking out their main fleet was just the first step." "You want to keep fighting?" Syra realized. "I want to finish it," she corrected. "Not just push them back, but dismantle their empire, piece by piece. Free every species they've ever conquered, and shatter their ability to ever threaten anyone again." Syra thought about it. The goal was massive, almost impossible. The Kree Dominion was a sprawling empire of hundreds of systems. Even with humanity's help, a full-scale conquest could take years, maybe even decades. But it was the right thing to do. It was the only goal that truly mattered. "The Confederation Council will have to give the final approval on any formal alliance," Syra said. "But I have no doubt they'll agree. We've been fighting this war for 15 long years, and every single day we knew we were going to lose. Now, for the very first time, we actually have a chance to win. They won't let that chance slip away." "Good." Vasquez held out her hand. It was a human custom, Syra knew, a way of sealing a deal. He took it. Her grip was firm, unwavering. "Admiral Vasquez," he said formally, "on behalf of the Valanthi Confederation, I accept your proposal. We will fight as one. We will win as one. And together, we will build something better from the ashes of this war." "Welcome to the Alliance, Admiral Syra." Outside, the stars shone like cold diamonds. Far away, the remnants of the Kree fleet were limping home, carrying the news of their impossible defeat. They would tell their masters what they saw. They would describe the strange human ships that absorbed their most powerful weapons and fought back with simple, solid projectiles. They would speak of the day Kree supremacy ended, and the entire galaxy would be listening. And for every species that had ever lived in fear, for every soul that believed domination was inevitable, for every person who had lost all hope, the message would be clear. The Kree could be defeated. The strong were not invincible. There was another way. It was the dawn of a revolution, and humanity was at the forefront. Back in her private quarters on the flagship, the Unconquered Sun, Admiral Vasquez finally let herself feel the bone-deep exhaustion. The face she showed the universe was always ironclad, always certain. But in private, she could face the truth. She was tired. She'd been shouldering the weight of this plan for years, knowing that one mistake could expose humanity for nothing. But she hadn't failed. The battle went exactly as they had simulated. The Kree energy weapons had been useless against their armor. The human railguns had sliced through Kree shields like they were made of foil. Every prediction from her scientists, every move from her strategists had been perfect. But now came the real work. Winning a single battle was one thing. Winning an entire war was another. The Kree would learn. They would analyze the human technology and develop ways to counter it. They would forge new weapons and new defenses. The incredible advantage humanity had right now wouldn't last. But that was a fight for another day. Today was a day for victory, a day to feel pride in what her people had done. Her comms console chirped. She reached over and tapped the screen. "Admiral," said her communications officer, "we're getting messages from every corner of the galaxy, ma'am. The news about the battle is spreading like wildfire. Everyone wants to know who humanity is." "Let them wonder for a little while longer," Vasquez said. "We'll make our official debut soon enough." "Yes, Admiral. But there is one message I think you'll want to take personally. It's from Earth, from the President." Vasquez immediately sat up straighter. "Patch her through." The screen shimmered, and the face of President Chen appeared. She was an older woman with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, the woman who had guided humanity for the last 12 years. She looked weary, but deeply satisfied. "Admiral Vasquez," she began, "I've been watching the reports. That was outstanding work. You've done humanity a great service today." "Thank you, Madam President. But all the credit goes to the men and women on those ships. They were flawless." "That they were, and so were you. But I'm not just calling to say congratulations. I'm calling because the galaxy just changed forever, and we need to talk about what comes next." Vasquez nodded. She knew this call was coming. "The galaxy knows we exist now. There's no more hiding." "Exactly. For 200 years we've stayed in the shadows, building our power, waiting for this very moment. Well, the moment is here. The big question is, what do we do now?" "I've already started talks with the Confederation's admiral. I believe they're open to a permanent alliance." "Good." President Chen's voice was steady, but her vision was radical. "Saving the Confederation is just putting out one fire. There are hundreds of other species in this galaxy, either crushed under the Kree's thumb or living in constant terror of them. They need to see there's another way. You want to expand our alliance? I want to build something entirely new. This won't be just another military pact. It'll be a new galactic community, one built on cooperation, not conquest. The Confederation tried this and failed because they didn't have the muscle to back it up. We do." Vasquez let the idea sink in. It was a staggering goal. Forging a new galactic order would take more than just ships. It would require masterful diplomacy, immense resources, and an ocean of patience. It meant winning over species who had been betrayed so many times they'd forgotten how to trust. It meant convincing them that humanity, the newcomers, were truly different from every other power they'd ever met. But that, she realized, was the whole point. Humanity didn't wait this long just to survive. They waited so they could lead. "I understand, Madam President. What are your orders for now?" she asked. "Lock down the alliance with the Confederation. Make it crystal clear that we are in this with them, for the long haul. Once that's solid, we start reaching out. The Kree have made enemies everywhere. Our job is to find them and unite them. It won't be a walk in the park. A lot of them will see us as just another empire on the rise. Then we'll have to prove them wrong with our actions, not just our words," President Chen said, leaning in. "Admiral, you went into that fight today because you knew it was the right thing to do. Not because it was easy, and definitely not because it was safe. That's our strength. That's what will make the galaxy trust us." "Yes, Madam President." "Good luck, Admiral. Everyone is watching. Show them who we really are." The screen winked out, leaving Vasquez in the quiet of her quarters, the weight of the future settling on her shoulders. The war wasn't over. It was only just getting started. But for the first time, she felt a profound certainty that they could actually win. She got up and moved to the viewport. Outside, the starfield was a brilliant, silent blaze. Out in that darkness, billions of lives were waking up to a completely new reality. A reality where the Kree could be broken. A reality where hope was no longer a dream. The future was unwritten. Humanity had just announced its arrival, and the galaxy would never be the same. Supreme Commander Vorax had never understood fear. From his first moments, he was taught that fear was a sickness, and weakness was a death sentence. The Kree way was brutally simple. You either dominate, or you are dominated. Fear had no place in that equation. Only power, only victory. But as his flagship limped through the void, a ghost ship sailing through the graveyard of his fleet, Vorax felt an icy dread crystallize in his gut. It wasn't exactly fear. It was something far worse. It was the crushing realization that his entire life, his entire civilization, was built on a lie. The bridge of the Eternal Dominion was a symphony of chaos. Officers yelled damage reports over one another as emergency lights painted the scene in strobing reds. The acrid smell of fried circuitry hung thick in the air. Deep within the ship's guts, crews were scrambling to patch the wound left by a human projectile that had ripped through the hull, killing 30 crewmen before lodging itself in a cargo bay. They got lucky. A few meters to the left, and it would have hit the reactor core. The Eternal Dominion would have become just another piece of glittering shrapnel in the Arcturus Nebula. "What are our losses?" Vorax demanded. His voice was like stone, but it had a tremor his officers had never heard before. "We're still getting the final numbers, Commander," Drath, his tactical officer, replied. His hands were visibly shaking as he swiped at his console. "But initial reports are showing over 300 vessels lost. Another 200 are crippled. They might not make it home." 300 ships, half his fleet, vaporized in the span of a few minutes. It was unthinkable. It was a disgrace. It was the single greatest defeat in the history of the Kree. "And the humans?" Vorax asked, his voice low. "How many of their ships did we take down?" Drath went silent for a beat. When he finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "None, Commander. We didn't destroy a single human ship." The words settled over the bridge like a funeral shroud. Vorax could feel the eyes of every officer on him, waiting for the explosion. In the Kree military, a failure of this magnitude was paid for in blood. By all rights, his own subordinates should be executing him right now. But not today. Today, everyone was too shell-shocked, too lost, too utterly broken to care about tradition. They had just witnessed the impossible. They had seen their weapons, the most feared in the galaxy, splash against primitive-looking ships like harmless rain. They had watched their impenetrable shields get sliced through as if they were made of paper. They were desperate for answers, for someone to explain the nightmare they had just lived through, and Vorax had no answers to give. "Set a course for home," he ordered, his voice hollow. "Maximum speed. We need to be in Dominion space before they decide to follow." "Commander," a junior officer spoke up, his voice trembling. What do we tell the High Council? How can we possibly explain this?" Vorax turned to face him. The officer was just a kid, really, barely old enough to be on a command bridge. He'd probably never seen a real battle before today. Now, he'd seen something that would haunt his dreams forever. "We tell them the truth," Vorax said. "The humans are not what we were told. They have weapons that bypass our shields. They have armor that shrugs off our cannons. We threw everything we had at them, and it wasn't even close to enough. The Council won't accept that. They will say you failed," the officer pressed. "I did fail," Vorax admitted, the words tasting like ash. "We all failed. For 10,000 years, we've fought our wars the same way, assuming no one could ever stand against us. We were arrogant, and we were wrong." The bridge went dead quiet as the Eternal Dominion raced through the darkness, its engines screaming as they tried to put as much distance as possible between them and the humans. Behind them, the wreckage of their invincible fleet was a sprawling memorial to their hubris. Vorax walked to the main view screen, staring into the starfield. Somewhere back there, the human fleet was likely celebrating. They had done what no one in 10,000 years had even dreamed of doing. They had shattered the Kree war machine. He began to contemplate what this meant for the Dominion. For millennia, his people had built an empire on the back of conquest. They took what they wanted because they could. They enslaved entire species because they were strong enough. Strength was the only law. Victory was the only truth. But what happens when your strength is no longer enough? What do you do when victory is suddenly impossible? The Dominion had no answer for that. It never thought it would need one. Across the galaxy, the news was spreading like a shockwave. The vast communication networks that tied thousands of worlds together now hummed with a single, astonishing message. The Kree had been defeated. The unbeatable empire was beaten. The galaxy was about to change forever. On the slave world of Taos 4, an old Mirandi worker heard the news from another prisoner who'd jury-rigged a receiver. The Mirandi was bent and broken from decades of hard labor in the Kree factories. He had given up on freedom so long ago he could barely remember what it felt like. But as he listened to what the humans had done, a tiny ember he thought had died long ago began to glow in his chest. It was hope, a dangerous, beautiful hope. At the bustling trade hub of Nexus Prime, merchants and travelers of 100 different species crowded around view screens, watching replays of the battle. They saw human ships tanking shots from Kree weapons without even a flicker. They saw massive Kree dreadnoughts torn apart one after another by energies no one had seen for 10 millennia. They whispered to each other, their voices a mix of awe and terror. Who were these humans? Where did they come from? And what did they want? In a secret asteroid base, lost in uncharted space, a small band of rebels who had waged a hopeless war against the Kree for decades watched the same footage. They had been whittled down to nothing but hit-and-run tactics, a nuisance at best. They had all accepted they would die fighting a lost cause. But now they saw a real possibility. The Kree could be beaten. The Empire could actually fall. They had a chance. And back on Earth, humanity's homeworld, a little girl watched the news with her parents. She didn't get all the details. She didn't know what a railgun was, or why solid armor was suddenly better than energy shields. But she understood the most important part. Her people had done something incredible. They had gone out and helped others who were being hurt. They had stood up to the biggest bullies in the galaxy, the ones everyone said were unstoppable. And she felt proud. She felt brave. She felt like anything was possible. Admiral Vasquez saw the reports of these reactions trickle in over the next few days. Her intelligence teams had plugged into networks all across the galaxy, gauging the response to their victory. The picture that was forming was a promising one. The Kree had always ruled through fear. They had mastered the art of convincing everyone that fighting back was pointless, that their power was absolute, that the only choice was to bow. In one single battle, humanity had shattered that carefully crafted illusion. The fear was still out there, of course, but it wasn't the only thing anymore. It was now mixed with something new, hope. The Confederation Council is asking for a formal meeting, her aide reported. They want to nail down the details of the alliance, what we need, what we can give, and the game plan moving forward. Schedule it for tomorrow, Vasquez ordered. I want our full diplomatic team there, and make sure they understand we aren't here for a hostile takeover. We're here to help. Yes, Admiral. And there's something else. We're getting messages from other species. Imagine being told your entire life that you are weak, that you exist only to serve a cruel, galaxy-spanning empire. Now imagine a message of hope arrives from a species you've never even heard of. That's the situation Admiral Vasquez was facing. Her screen was flooded with messages from species crushed under the thumb of the Kree Dominion, all begging for help. The galaxy was vast, and the Kree had made enemies everywhere. Some species were enslaved, others were in hiding. Now, hearing of humanity's impossible victory, they were reaching out. If you think one small victory can't spark a revolution, you're going to want to see how this plays out. Vasquez took a deep breath. "Get these messages sorted," she commanded. "Put the ones in immediate danger at the top of the list, then potential allies, then everyone else. We're going to answer every single one." Her aide looked stunned. "Admiral, that could take months." Vasquez gave a grim smile. "Then we'd better get started." And so, humanity scattered across the stars, not as conquerors, but as diplomats and advisors. They met with species who had never laid eyes on a human before. They brought advanced tech and powerful weapons, sure, but they offered something far more revolutionary, a vision. A promise that the galaxy didn't have to be a place where the strong devoured the weak. They proposed a radical idea, that different peoples could actually work together. But not everyone was buying it. Many were deeply suspicious, seeing humanity as just the next big empire hungry for power. They'd seen it all before, grand promises of peace from those secretly preparing for war. "Why are you any different?" they'd ask. And Vasquez knew that was a fair question. She knew words were not enough. The only way to earn their trust was through action, one right decision at a time. It would require incredible patience, but she believed it was possible. All the while, the war raged on. The Kree had pulled back to their core systems, but they were far from beaten. They still controlled hundreds of worlds, billions of lives, and thousands of warships. The losses they suffered were a huge blow, but for an empire that vast, it was a wound they could recover from. Worse, they were smart. Reports flooded in that Kree scientists were frantically trying to reverse engineer human technology, piecing together the secrets of the railguns that had shredded their fleet. They knew their old energy weapons were like pop guns against human ships, so they were racing to build something new. Vasquez had expected this. The Kree didn't build an intergalactic empire by being idiots. They would learn, adapt, and evolve. Humanity's technological edge wouldn't last forever, which meant they had to move fast. They needed to press their advantage before the Kree could regroup. Every system they freed was one less factory for the Dominion's war machine, and every slave they liberated was a potential new soldier for the Alliance. The first major target was the Orion sector, the agricultural heartland of the Dominion. A garrison of 200 ships stood guard. It was a big force, but nothing like the grand fleet that humanity had already turned to dust. Vasquez led the attack herself. The human fleet, now bolstered by allied ships upgraded with human tech, warped in with perfect, terrifying precision. The Kree defenders scrambled, but it wasn't a battle. It was a demolition. It was a shocking surprise to see that the Kree hadn't learned a single thing. Their ships still used the same useless energy weapons and shields. Their plasma cannons splashed harmlessly against human hulls. They fought with courage, but courage doesn't stop a solid chunk of metal moving at near light speed. In a matter of minutes, human railguns tore the entire garrison to pieces. Ship after ship just vanished in silent, fiery explosions, their shields and armor utterly useless. The Kree commander desperately tried to order a retreat, but there was nowhere left to run. The human fleet had them completely boxed in. When the smoke cleared, not a single Kree ship was left. The Orion sector was free. That same story started playing out all across the galaxy. Human-led fleets, growing every day with new allies, struck at Kree strongholds. Some fights were easy, against isolated garrisons who hadn't even heard what was coming. Others were tougher. The Kree were learning. They started rolling out new kinetic weapons, copies of human designs. They developed new armor, trying to mimic what made human ships so impossibly tough. They even changed tactics, switching to hit-and-run ambushes instead of direct fights. But here was the biggest surprise of all for them. They were always one step behind. Humanity had been secretly developing its technology for 2 centuries, while the galaxy stagnated under Kree rule. The gap was just too big to close. For every new weapon the Kree invented, humanity had a counter they'd designed decades ago. Months turned into years. The alliance swelled in size as more and more species, inspired by the victories and the promise of freedom, joined the cause. The old Confederation, once on the brink of total collapse, was now more powerful than ever. New shipyards churned out hybrid vessels, combining sleek alien designs with unstoppable human weapons. New armies marched to liberate worlds that had known nothing but Kree oppression for generations. And watching it all from deep within enemy territory was Supreme Commander Vorax. He was the one who had lost that first, pivotal battle and had somehow survived the political fallout. He'd convinced the High Council that his first-hand experience fighting these strange newcomers made him too valuable to execute. So they gave him the impossible job of holding the line against the human tide. It was a hopeless task. Every battle was the same. His ships would fire everything they had, only to watch the human vessels absorb the punishment and return fire that vaporized his fleet. The new Kree weapons were better, but not good enough. The new armor helped, but not enough. The humans were just better. Vorax had spent his entire life believing in the absolute superiority of his people. It was the bedrock of his entire civilization. And it was all a lie. The humans weren't superior in any way he could understand. Their ships were clunky and ugly. Their culture was bizarre. They didn't fight for glory or conquest. They fought for ideas, for crazy things like freedom and cooperation. And somehow, those ideas were crushing a 10,000-year-old empire. Vorax watched the latest reports flash across his screen. Another sector lost. Another fleet annihilated. The Dominion was crumbling, being eaten away by an enemy that refused to play by the rules. He knew that in a year, maybe two, the humans would be at their home world. They would demand surrender, and for the first time in history, the Dominion would have no choice but to obey. 10,000 years of glory, all brought to an end by a stubborn species that was never supposed to win. A tiny traitorous part of Vorax almost admired them. Almost. He pulled up an old recording of that first battle, one he'd watched 1,000 times. He saw the human ships advance, saw his own weapons fire uselessly, and then the return fire. He paused on the image of the first Kree ship exploding. 4 seconds. It took 4 seconds from the moment the human projectile hit to the moment a warship that took years to build ceased to exist. 4 seconds to prove his entire life was a lie. "Commander," a voice said, shaking him from his thoughts. "We have an incoming message. It's from the human fleet." Vorax's heart hammered in his chest. The humans had never contacted him directly. "Put it on screen." An image flickered to life, showing an older human female with gray hair and eyes that looked as tired as he felt. He recognized her from the intelligence files. Admiral Vasquez, the architect of his ruin. "Supreme Commander Vorax," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "I hope this message finds you well." "What do you want?" Vorax growled. "I want to offer you a choice," she said calmly. "This war is almost over. Your fleets are gone. Your territory is shrinking. Soon we will be at your home world. When that happens, you will either surrender or you will be extinct." "Then we will die," he spat. "The Kree do not surrender." "I know that's what your culture teaches," she replied, "that submission is a fate worse than death. But I'm not asking you to submit. I'm asking you to evolve." Vorax stared, speechless. "Explain," he finally managed. "The galaxy is changing, Commander," she said. "The old way of things, the strong dominating the weak, the endless cycle of conquest and slavery, it's over. There is a better path. Cooperation. Equality." "The fantasies of weaklings," he scoffed. "It's not a fantasy, it's our reality. Look at what we've built in just a few years, she continued. Species that were bitter enemies are now our strongest allies. Worlds that were stripped bare are now thriving. Our alliance is stronger than your empire ever was because it's built on trust, not fear. So here is the big reveal, Commander. What role would the Kree play in this alliance? Not slaves, not servants. You would be partners. Your people have skills, resources. In return, you'd get our protection, our trade, our technology. A chance to build something better. Vorax fell silent, the offer hanging in the air. A part of him, the soldier bred for conquest, wanted to scream in defiance, but another, newer part of him, the part that had watched his empire crumble, was forced to listen. For the first time, he saw a future that wasn't just about victory or death, but about a real, lasting peace. And the moral of the story? True strength isn't about conquering others. It's about having the courage to build something together. Every ounce of his training screamed that this was a setup, a trick designed to make them let their guard down. But a different part of him, a part he'd tried to bury since Arcturus, whispered that she might have a point. The old ways had spectacularly failed. 10,000 years of brutal conquest had led them here, to defeat, humiliation, and the ashes of everything they had built. Maybe it was time for a new approach. I can't make this call on my own, he said at last. The High Council will have to sign off on it. I understand. Take this message to them. Tell them humanity is offering peace, not domination. Let them know there's a place for the crest in this new galaxy, if they're willing to take it. And if they say no? Vasquez's expression was impossible to read. Then we'll do what we have to, but I truly hope it doesn't come to that. There's been more than enough death. The transmission cut out. Vorax sat in the echoing silence, staring at the blank screen. He had a choice to make, a message to carry, and a future to decide. For the first time in his entire life, he had no idea what the right move was. 2 years after the Battle of Arcturus, the war was over. It didn't end with a blaze of glory or the obliteration of the Kree home world. It ended quietly, in a conference room on a neutral station, where leaders from the Galactic Alliance sat across a table from the broken remnants of the Kree Dominion. Vorax was in that room, though he was no longer the Supreme Commander. The High Council had stripped him of that title, blaming him for the losses that shattered their empire. He didn't care about the title. He'd stopped caring about a lot of things over the past 2 years. Watching your entire civilization crumble around you tends to shift your priorities. Admiral Vasquez was there too, speaking for humanity. She looked older than she had at Arcturus. Her hair was a little whiter, the lines on her face a little deeper. The war had taken its toll on everyone, even the winners, maybe especially the winners. The treaty itself was straightforward. The Kree Dominion would give up all its conquered worlds. They would set free every population they had enslaved. They would shrink their military down to a simple defense force, with strict caps on ship numbers and weapon types. In return, they could keep their homeworld and their core systems. They wouldn't be wiped out or occupied. They would get a chance to start over. It was a generous deal, far more generous than the Kree would have ever offered an enemy they had beaten. Many in the Alliance had pushed for much harsher punishment. After all, the Kree had committed horrific crimes over their centuries of expansion. Millions were dead. Entire species had been enslaved or completely exterminated. Justice, they argued, demanded retribution. But Vasquez had insisted on mercy. It wasn't because she was soft or naive. It was because she understood something her critics didn't. Punishment breeds resentment, and resentment breeds more war. If the Alliance wanted a peace that would actually last, they had to give the Kree a path forward, a reason to change, not a reason to plot revenge. The Kree High Council argued for weeks before finally agreeing to the terms. Plenty of them wanted to fight to the bitter end, preferring to go extinct rather than surrender. But in the end, common sense won out. The Dominion was shattered. Their fleets were gone. Their empire was a memory, Fighting on would achieve nothing but the complete annihilation of their species. So, they signed the treaty. The war was officially over. Vasquez didn't pop any champagne. She was just too tired to celebrate. She went back to her ship, sat in her quarters, and just stared out at the stars. 2 years of non-stop war, thousands of battles, millions of lives lost on both sides. And for what? A better galaxy, she told herself. A chance for something new. But the price had been astronomical. A knock came at her door. She sat up a little straighter in her chair and called out, "Come in." Admiral Sarath stepped inside. He was a different man from the young officer she'd met at Arcturus. The war had hardened him, giving him a weight he didn't have before. He was now in command of the Confederation fleet, the second largest force in the Alliance right after the human navy. "Admiral Vasquez," he said, "I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all. Please have a seat." Sarath sat across from her. For a moment they just sat in silence. They'd fought side by side for 2 years, sharing victories and defeats, triumphs and heartbreaks. They had a connection that went deeper than rank or species. "The treaty is signed," Sarath finally said. "The war is over, but for some reason I can't feel happy about it." "I know what you mean. It doesn't feel like a victory. It feels like we just managed to survive." "Yes, that's it exactly." Sarath gazed out the viewport at the endless stars. "I keep thinking about everyone who died, all the ships we lost, the worlds that were turned to dust. We won, but it cost so much." Vasquez nodded slowly. "That's the ugly truth about war. Even when you win, you lose. The only question is whether what you gained was worth the price." And was it? Vasquez thought about that for a long moment. It wasn't a simple question. 2 years ago, she had led a fleet into a fight against impossible odds. She had bet everything on the idea that human ingenuity could tip the scales. She'd been right, but being right had unleashed a war on a scale the galaxy had never imagined. "I think so," she said finally. "The Kree would have eventually conquered everyone. They would have enslaved or wiped out every species that wasn't them. We stopped that. We saved billions of lives, even if we couldn't save them all. So what's next? Now we build. The Alliance is strong, but it's also brand new. The species that banded together to fight the Kree are still figuring out how to work together. There are going to be arguments. There will be friction. In some ways, peace is a lot harder than war." Sarath managed a small smile. "You don't paint a very rosy picture." "I paint an honest one, but I am hopeful we can make it work. Humanity has spent 2 centuries getting ready for this moment, and I don't just mean building ships and weapons. We developed the skills to lead. We understand diplomacy, cooperation, and that a lasting peace needs more than just military might." "That's why you gave the Kree such a generous deal." "Exactly. They're not evil, Sarath. They're not monsters. They're a species whose entire civilization was built on a broken philosophy. If we give them a real chance to change, I believe many of them will take it. In a generation or 2, the Kree could become vital members of this alliance." Sarath looked unconvinced. "That's a very optimistic take." "Maybe, but optimism is what got humanity through its own dark ages. We believe things can get better. We believe people can change. We believe the future isn't written by the past. And if you're wrong, if the Kree don't change, then we'll handle it. But I'd rather aim for the best possible future than just assume the worst." They sat in silence a while longer, just watching the stars drift by. Finally, Sarath stood up. "I should get back to my ship. There's a lot to do. The Confederation Council is meeting tomorrow to talk about switching over to a peacetime government. I look forward to working with them." Vasquez stood up too and offered her hand. "Admiral Sarath, it's been a true honor serving with you." Sarath took her hand. "The honor was all mine, Admiral Vasquez. Humanity saved my people. We won't forget it." He left. Vasquez sat back down, her eyes returning to the stars. The war was over, but her job was far from done. As the head of humanity's military, she had a huge role to play in building this new galactic order. There were trade deals to hammer out, arguments to settle, and crises to solve. The Alliance was going to face problems no one could even imagine yet. Her job was to make sure it didn't fall apart. She thought about Earth. She hadn't been home in years. Her family was there, waiting. Her grandkids were born during the war. She'd never even held them. Maybe soon. Maybe once things settled down, she could take some leave and go home. Walk the streets of the city where she grew up. See the mountains and the oceans again. Remind herself what it was all for. But not yet. There was still way too much to do. The months that came after were tough, but full of hope. The Alliance created a new government, the Galactic Council, with leaders from every member species. Humanity had a major seat at the table, but Vasquez was firm that they shouldn't run the whole show. The council was built to be a democracy, where every species had a say. The change wasn't easy. Species that had been bitter enemies for generations had to figure out how to cooperate. Old grudges came to the surface. New arguments broke out. There were times it felt like the Alliance would collapse before it even got started. But it held together. Slowly, and often painfully, the different species started to trust one another. They built trade routes and shared technology. They put together peacekeeping forces to handle arguments. They opened schools where kids from different planets could grow up and learn together. The Kree, surprisingly, adjusted better than anyone thought they would. The younger generation, the ones who grew up seeing the Empire fall, were much more open to new ideas than their parents. They saw firsthand that the old ways had led to ruin, and they wanted a different future. Not all of them, of course. There were always the hardliners who refused to accept defeat, who secretly plotted to rise again and get their revenge. But they were a minority, and their numbers shrank every year. Most Kree just wanted to live their lives, raise their kids, and find their new place in the galaxy. Vorax was one of them. After the treaty was signed, he retired from the military. He had no stomach for politics, and the new High Council wanted nothing to do with the man who'd lost the war. So he went back to his home world to try and figure out what to do with the rest of his life. It wasn't easy. He'd spent every waking moment of his existence as a warrior. He had no idea how to be anything else. For that first year, he just drifted. Lost, without a purpose. That's when a human diplomat found him. She was young, full of that bright-eyed idealism and endless energy that humans all seem to have. She asked if he'd be willing to speak at a conference about the war, to share the Kree perspective on everything that went down. He shot her down at first. I mean, why would anyone want to listen to a defeated commander? What could he possibly say that would make any difference? But she didn't give up. She explained that to build a real, lasting peace, you had to understand your enemy's point of view. That old foes could become the best teachers, helping everyone else avoid the mistakes of the past. That his experience was something valuable, not something to be ashamed of. Finally, he said yes. He stood on a stage in front of an audience of hundreds of different species from all across the galaxy, and he told them about the war. Not the tactics and the troop movements, but the core beliefs that drove the Krari to conquer. The philosophy that convinced them that all other species were inferior. The absolute blindness that led them straight to their own ruin. He talked about what it felt like to watch everything you believed in just crumble to dust, to finally realize that your entire civilization was built on a complete lie, to face that impossible choice between clinging to a dead past and stepping into a terrifying, unknown future. When he was done, the room was dead silent. Then slowly, someone started clapping, then another, and another. Beings who had lost loved ones to the Kree war machine were giving a standing ovation to a Kree commander. It was weird. It was surreal. And maybe, just maybe, it was the start of something new. After the conference, that young human diplomat found him again. She thanked him for his courage. She told him his words had truly meant something to people who were desperately trying to find a way to forgive. Vorax asked her why humanity had been so kind to its enemies, why they offered peace when they could have had revenge, why they were trying so hard to build a galaxy that had a place for everyone, even for the ones who had tried to burn it all down. She just smiled and said one word: stubborn. At first, Vorax didn't get it, so the human explained that her species had managed to survive by simply refusing to give up, by holding on to hope when everything seemed lost, by believing that things could always get better, no matter how dark it got. And that stubbornness, she said, was how they treated everyone else too. The thing about humans was their stubborn refusal to give up on anyone, including themselves. They clung to this wild notion that enemies could become allies, that entire societies could change for the better, and that the past didn't have to write the future. By every standard Vorax had ever known, it was a ridiculously sentimental and foolish philosophy. The crazy part? It was actually working. The alliance was stronger than any empire built on fear ever could be, simply because it was founded on partnership. Races that should have been at each other's throats for eternity were now working together, driven by common goals and a surprising level of mutual respect. Vorax chewed on this for a long, long time. When he finally landed on a conclusion, it was one that would have made his younger self laugh out loud. The humans, for all their weird, confusing, and illogical ways, were right. Not about everything, but they were right about the one thing that truly mattered. Raw power wasn't the answer. Conquest was a snake that always ended up eating its own tail. The only way to build something that would stand the test of time was to build it together. So he took up the cause. He traveled the length and breadth of the Old Dominion, talking to Kree communities about the new shape of the galaxy. He explained that laying down their arms wasn't the same as surrendering their pride, and that working with others didn't make them weak. He showed them that embracing change wasn't the same as admitting defeat. Some wouldn't listen, but enough did. Those who opened their minds began to change, and they, in turn, convinced others. Slowly, 1 year at a time, the Kree stopped being subjects of the Alliance and started becoming a part of it. Model this. 20 years after the Battle of Arcturus, the galaxy was a completely different place. Species that had been at war for centuries were now trading partners. Worlds that had been scarred by conflict were now rebuilt and thriving. The children of former enemies were now playing together, learning each other's languages, and sharing each other's cultures. Admiral Vasquez, who had been retired for years, traveled to the stars one last time. She'd been asked to give a speech at the 20th anniversary celebration of the Alliance. It was being held at Arcturus Station, which was built right on the site of the battle that had changed everything. The station itself was massive, a shining example of what the allied species could achieve when they finally worked together. Millions of beings lived there, representing hundreds of different worlds. It was a symbol of the new galaxy, a place where differences were something to be celebrated, not feared. Vasquez stood at the podium and gazed out at the incredible crowd. She saw Volanthians and Mirandans and Teth. She saw Kree and humans and dozens of species she'd never even seen before. She saw the future. 20 years ago, she began, humanity entered the Warzone. Our shields collapsed in seconds. The enemy didn't last a minute. A wave of laughter rolled through the crowd. The story had become a legend, told and retold so many times, polished and exaggerated until it was more myth than history. But that's not the real story, Vasquez went on. The real story isn't about shields or weapons or fancy technology. The real story is about what happened next. She paused, letting her eyes sweep over the faces in front of her. After the battle, we had a choice. We could have used our power to conquer, just like the Kree had done. We could have built a new empire on the ashes of the old one. We would have been strong. We would have been feared. And we would have failed, just like every single empire before us has always failed. Instead, we chose a different path. We chose to share our strength instead of hoarding it for ourselves. We chose to lift our allies up instead of standing on their backs. We chose to believe that a galaxy united was infinitely stronger than a galaxy divided.
It wasn't easy. There were times when it felt completely impossible. There were times when we just wanted to give up, to pull back to our own borders and let the rest of you figure out your own messes. But we didn't give up. We're human. We're stubborn. More laughter erupted. That word had become famous, a kind of shorthand for everything that made humanity so different. And 20 years later, just look at what we've built. Not an empire, but a community. Not subjects, but partners. This station, this celebration, all of you standing here together. This is what humanity was fighting for all along. Not conquest, not domination. Connection. Vasquez felt tears welling up in her eyes. She was an old woman now, older than she ever thought she'd be. But she was so incredibly proud. Proud of what her people had managed to do. Proud of the galaxy they had helped to create. I won't live to see what this alliance becomes in 100 years. Or 1,000. But I believe it will last. I believe it will grow. I believe that the people of this galaxy will keep finding new ways to work together, to overcome their differences, to build something far greater than any one species could ever achieve alone. That is humanity's gift to the galaxy, not our weapons or our armor. It's our belief that tomorrow can always be better than today. Our refusal to accept that conflict is the only way. Our stubborn, foolish, wonderful hope. She stepped back from the podium. The crowd exploded into applause, beings of every species cheering as one. Vasquez smiled and waved, then turned and walked slowly off the stage. Cyrus was waiting for her in the wings. He was old too. His scales were faded and he moved slowly, but his eyes were still as sharp as ever, still full of that incredible intelligence that had served him so well. That was a good speech, he said. It was the truth, Vasquez replied. Well, he rumbled, that's all that really matters, isn't it? They walked together toward the observation deck, where they could look out at the endless sea of stars. The galaxy stretched out before them, vast and mysterious and brimming with possibility. Do you remember what you said to me, right after the battle? Cyrus asked. When I asked you what made humanity so different. Vasquez thought back. It felt like another lifetime. I said we were stubborn. Yes, I didn't understand it back then. I thought it was some kind of joke, or maybe a bad translation. But now, Cyrus was quiet for a moment. Now, I understand. Stubbornness isn't just about refusing to give up. It's about refusing to accept that the world can't change for the better. It's about continuing to push forward even when everyone around you is saying it's impossible. It's about believing in the future, even when the present looks so dark. That's a pretty good definition, she said softly. It's what saved us. Ah. What saved all of us. Cyrus turned to look at her. Thank you, Elena. For everything. Vasquez smiled. In all their years of working together, he had never once used her first name. It felt right, somehow. Like the closing of one chapter and the start of another. Thank you, Cyrus, for trusting us, for giving us a chance to prove what we could do. They stood there for a long time, side by side, just watching the stars. Somewhere out there, human ships were still on patrol, keeping the peace. Somewhere out there, species that had once been bitter enemies were learning how to be friends. Somewhere out there, children were growing up in a galaxy that was safer and kinder than the one their parents had ever known. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. But it was better, and better was always worth fighting for.
The galaxy had changed, and humanity had helped make that happen. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.